during the COVID-19 isolation, many Finns returned back to their roots and spent a lot of time in the forest, including myself. I would like to thank the ISME Commission on Special Music Education and Music Therapy for inviting me to be a keynote speaker for this seminar. And I would also like to thank all of you who are taking the time to watch and listen to my talk. We will have the opportunity to engage in shared discussions during the online session hosted by the Commission on July 31st. So, due to the unfortunate global circumstances, we will not be sitting together in the Resonari Music School, which is located in a comfy house in a quiet residential area in eastern Helsinki. Nevertheless, I would like to share with you my personal connections to Resonari. My teaching career in Resonari started 17 years ago. Being a young music educator without a background in special education or music therapy at that time, and be given the opportunity to work with students who were assigned to the category of special needs, had a huge effect on the construction of my professional identity. I engaged in practical hands-on learning of the music teaching profession, and in retrospect, my becoming of who I am today was strongly affected by students and colleagues in Resonari. While working with students with various backgrounds, characteristics and needs, Resonari offered an encouraging and open space for the rich use of different tools, methods and ideas to support the students' learning and music making. I was often given the opportunity to take up the challenge and also to learn from my own mistakes and confrontations. Over time, I repeatedly faced ambiguity in situations where my professional profile and pathway was to be described and defined either by myself or the others. Situations like this compelled me to ask, what kind of music teacher identity was I expected to construct within Resonari's practices? And how were the practices related to the majority landscape of music education? And also, perhaps most importantly, in line with the inclusive aims and ideals promoted by Resonari, how did we know that we are on the right path? These processes of self-reflection furthered and expanded to identify the inconsistencies between pedagogical intentions and real outcomes. These tensions and prevailing questions strongly affected my willingness to continue expanding my professionalism towards research and especially to the theories of inclusion and disability. The discourse of diversity has thus far divided the social world into distinct categories such as ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, age, religion, language, and ability. While disability has been rather absent in the early conceptualizations of diversity, in these times where neoliberalism drives understandings of economic, physical and mental weaknesses as human deficiencies that prevent the construction of a competitive and wealthy society, a broader conceptualization of diversity than the one limited to multiculturalism is certainly needed more than ever. Hence, although emphasizing that disability is not the only identity available for people given such a medicalized assignment, I attend to disability as stated by Alison Darrow, an often forgotten, dismissed, or overlooked as an important part of what we consider to be diversity. In this talk, I will argue that the stereotypic and stigmatizing views of disability have remained unchallenged in music education. There are only a few examples of independent and empowering teacher, student, or musician stories of individuals assigned in the category of disabilities, examples that are not representations of overcoming narratives. Overcoming narratives are narratives with the undercover purpose of communicating to the non-disabled majority a relief of their anxieties about experiencing a similar tragedy of being disabled. In the same vein, the music education field seems to have uncritically adopted the inclusive education agenda without deeper reflections about what it actually might mean. Hence, the disability culture remains located within the special education field without approaching it as a socially and culturally constructed concept and striving to challenge the hegemonies of music education and musicianship. I claim that the dynamics between special education and the new, more radical and political forms of inclusive education have so far remained under-discussed in music education. As a result, no matter how well-intended, when continuing to divide students into the categories of normal and special, music education remains a wider issue of majority versus minority, and hence a political problem. In aiming to seek alternatives for the ableist hegemonies that have thus far pervaded music education, I will first discuss disability from a performative aspect in music and music education, extending to the perspectives of music teacher education and teacher professionalism. Then I will suggest a complex political view on inclusion that may help us envision how and why disability could be reconsidered in music education. Finally, through theorizations of inclusion and intersectional perspectives, I suggest problematizing the conceptual starting points for both inclusion and diversity. I draw from theorists of inclusive education, as well as from my earlier independent and co-authored works with my colleagues Warren Churchill, Patrick Schmidt, and Heidi Westerlund. You will find all the mentioned references at the end of this presentation. We can start examining the performativity aspect of disability in music education by discussing its connection to performance. In their book, Theorizing Disability in Music, Lerner and Strauss state that a disability may remain invisible until it is performed. Koppers has contemplated the wavering role of the disabled performer on stage on one hand as invisible and on the other as hypervisible. Quote, "The disabled performer is marginalized and invisible, relegated to borderlands far outside the central area of cultural activity into the discourse of medicine, therapy, and victimhood. At the same time, people with physical impairments are also hypervisible, instantly defined in their physicality. The physically impaired performer has therefore to negotiate two areas of cultural meaning: invisibility as an active member in the public sphere, and hypervisibility and instant categorization." End of quote. Koppers draws attention to the apparent visible-invisible paradox of disability. However, I would like to add that disability is often regarded as the thing that is performed as such. The performance is then often regarded as emerging from the individual who exhibits some form of marked difference. This may lead us to ask, how is disability performed in music educational contexts? Music education scholars such as Patrick Schmidt, Pam Bernard, and Panos Kanellopoulos have criticized the performativity-oriented music education model that manifests itself through the use of student selection and music criteria that defines who is entitled to learn and perform music and what real musical agency or real musicianship looks and sounds like. Based on my experiences as a teacher educator for music, dance, theatre and visual arts students, the performativity aspect in music is perhaps even more burdensome than in other art forms, and it spills beyond the educational realms to socially constructed views on musicianship. Between 2015 to 2017, I carried out an experiment together with Resonari that already then had established a training program supporting professional musicianship for its music school students. This program entails that former students of Resonari study and work as assistant teachers within the music school as well as outside. We created a collaboration with the University of the Arts where two Resonari's musicians worked as visiting teachers in a course for the teacher students. This collaboration opened up new insights on the professionalism that also challenged the traditional performativity-oriented perspectives in music education. The encounters between Resonari's professional musicians and future music educators at the Sibelius Academy allowed for new, diverse, non-hierarchical expert perspectives and positions where those who are traditionally relegated to marginalized positions were taking the role of a teacher. I want to note here, however, that challenging the performative aspect of disability through inclusive partnerships and collaboration between able-bodied and disabled individuals does not happen easily. Through my own experiences and negotiations of the roles and of the choice and voice, also the spatial and academic demands within inclusive research processes, I have come to a realization that mere participation does not equate with inclusion. Bringing a person labeled in the category of disability into higher education context does not solve the broader issues of power and control, nor does it miraculously make the situation or the process of knowledge co-construction more inclusive. Here, complexity steps into the picture. But before continuing to the questions and dynamics of inclusion in terms of complexity, I would like to share another example with you that has inspired me and many others in the field of music and arts to think about inclusion from an alternative perspective. Pertti Kurikan Nimipäivät, shortened as PKN, is a punk band of 4 middle-aged men who met each other in Resonari and later in a culture workshop for disabled individuals. They have released several albums and toured in Europe and North America, and their story has been the basis for 2 awarded documentary films, The Punk Syndrome and The Punk Voyage. In 2015, PKN was chosen to represent Finland in the Eurovision Song Contest and was thrust into the international mass media spotlight. This resulted in widespread and controversial debates in social media, not only about PKN's musical performance, but also about prejudice and the rights of persons with disabilities in society. The phenomenon as a whole forcefully framed shared reflections with regards to who decides who is entitled to be a performing musician and on what premises. Despite the criticism and wonderments of norms, definitions, rights and limits, PKN simply continued doing what they wanted to do, punk. Later on, members of PKN have expanded their dedication to politics, activism and visual arts. Today, they are operating a cultural space for outsider art called Pertti's Choice. Assembled from an art shop, gallery and a production label, Pertti's Choice is a forerunner as the first social enterprise in Finland entirely founded by disabled people. What makes the PKN as an interesting case is that they do not operate within the field that might have been traditionally assigned to them as disabled individuals. They do not only collaborate with caregiving institutions, disability organizations, or charities. They step straight into the center without apologizing or asking for permission. They collaborate with established institutions such as Eurovision, the Finnish Cultural Institute, international record labels, and a Finnish whiskey brand, to name a few. Ruth Wright has illustrated the social production of pedagogical discourse on musical knowledge, where the thinkable, thus socially acceptable, becomes a process of transmitting hegemonic values. By contrast, the unthinkable remains a subcultural phenomenon that may cause occasional fluctuation in the field of discursive power, as PKN might be seen doing. In my earlier work, I have attempted to turn the discussion in our field from the regimes of truth towards a more complex view by stating inclusion as an impossibility. What I suggest is that instead of asking how is inclusion possible within wider contexts than just in those for the ones who are interested in special cases or developing new accessible teaching methods, for example, we should admit inclusion as a paradoxical concept per se and ask what needs to be changed in our current practices and discourses in order to challenge the taken for granted and continuously transform the scripted realities in music education, especially considered for those who are assigned to the category of disability or special needs. Indeed, if we consider the common ideals of inclusion and diversity through the terms and understandings that the prevailing hegemonic discourses in music education offer us, they certainly seem impossible, or, within the same discursive reality, we could alternatively state that there is no problem whatsoever. This unproblematic view of inclusion suggests that once all people are included, democracy has been reached and becomes a normal condition of society. Rather than seeing inclusion as a process of bringing those in the margins to the center through allowing or restricting possibilities for participation, we might want to regard inclusion as a sporadic process, where those who include and are included cannot be separated. In other words, this type of problematizing perspective on inclusion not only allows for but requires reciprocal transformation and disagreement of the status quo in individual, social, and political dimensions. Hence, inclusion becomes a political project that does not aim to prove or disprove that all human beings are equal, but to see what can be done differently under the current circumstances. One example of this complexity is that if we reject seeing disabled bodies automatically invisible and powerless, do we then neglect the individual experience of disability and the potential need for care and support? Neither of these options is correct or the right way. Still, we more or less unintentionally exercise both views in our thinking and action, and everything in between. Indeed, acknowledging that education always involves the exertion of power makes it a political project, whether the question is about opening up or narrowing down educational spaces based on the individual's assumed disabilities or special needs. Hence, in trying to make sense of the complexity of inclusion as something that may be simultaneously existent and absent, it is crucial to aim to connect individual and shared experiences with political aims, meanings, and actions. With this respect, it is the reconsiderations of the inclusion directions rather than the outcomes that matter. In other words, inclusion must be seen as an ongoing process that cannot be realized through teaching future teachers how to make education more inclusive, but to open up spaces for an ongoing political project that does not have a clear predetermined outcome. PKN, indeed, has not had a clear predetermined outcome. Their artistry and personalities have led to uncomfortable, surprising, sometimes unforgettably wonderful, and sometimes unforgettably disastrous moments. The key is that they have been allowed to fail like anyone else. No attempt has been made to protect or guide them simply because they are disabled. Envisioning education as a place for experimentation with the possibility of the impossible points in the direction of making more use of our imagination beyond the normalized prescriptive structures of teaching and learning music. With respect to disability, this must be understood as more than just designing new teaching methods that are based on a preconceived notion of what is good for the students we consider as special. As I stated in the beginning of this talk, disability is still often considered as a single dimension of inequality that is scrutinized distinctively, partly because disability per se tends to be more difficult to consolidate than racial, national, or gender-based identities. Not only is disability defined differently depending on language and cultural context, it is also a concept that is given a different kind of subjectivity compared to other forms of diversity. Hence, it is important to consider that the dynamics of intersectional identities, including the disabled identity, are fragmented and fluctuating and manifest in individuals' everyday lives in complex and entangled ways. Taking into account the dynamics of the intersectionality of different categories of human diversity as hardly separable, demands a much broader understanding of diversity and inclusion from us music educators in current neoliberal times. This entails contextual interrogation of the possibilities and the restrictions of gaining meaningful agency and citizenship within and beyond music education in ethical, structural, and political dimensions. There is no need to establish consensus with regards to what real musical participation or agency looks like through abandoning or underlining difference. Instead, the constant troubling of power relations, false dichotomies, deficit categorizations, and traditional practices, policies, or politics, as well as assuming inclusion as a political action rather than a limited set of practices and policies, are imperative for reaching beyond the narrow and adverse understandings of disability. Finally, I want to emphasize that writing or talking about the notion of disability from the position of an able-bodied person is not unproblematic. Even by making these statements, runs the risk of a social distinction between deviant and normative bodies. Nevertheless, to humbly consider myself no more than temporarily able-bodied either does not take away the stigmatized notion of some bodies as perpetually excluded by dominant ideals and socially constructed understandings of human being. Hence, an important question is, where should we undertake these discussions and with or by whom? In hopes to contribute to our shared effort of constructing a more socially just and democratic future for music education, I now invite you to imagine together with me What might inclusion look like in our music educational contexts, considering the complexity of how is disability defined and performed within our dominant views and considerations? In terms of music classroom practice or music teacher education, practicing this social imagination might require troubling the ableist center of music education by becoming more aware of how we might add to a co-performance of dualistic identities. As music educators, we have the advantage of drawing upon the positive political potentials of music as a means of forging new options and representations of co-performing disability, as the PKN example shows. This might inspire us to more actively resist music education paradigms that focus on teacher and musician performativity. In all of these ways, we might counter making disability invisible and instead engage in a political project of bridging the divide between the center and others in music education. Thank you for listening. Take care and be safe, and hopefully one day I'll see you outside the forest.